Hello, I'm Anastasia Melnik and you're watching Q&A program on Espresso TV. Today I'm honored to have such a great guest, Tymothy Snyder, who is a historian and a scientist, a professor of history in Yale University, who's specializing in Ukrainian, Russian, and basically the history of the whole region. I'm glad to see you today here. It's a great honor for us to see you. So we're coming up with the first question about basically your book on a history, which is the Bloodlands Europe between Hitler and Stalin. So we can see that not the first time, but hopefully the last, Ukraine becomes a battlefield between other countries. So now it's Russia, Western countries too. How would you comment on that, and why did it happen, and what are your reflections on current historical moment?
Well, the two most important historical lessons are, I think, clear to all Ukrainians. The first is the significance of having your own sovereign and independent state. The fundamental reason why Ukraine could be a colony of Germany or a colony of Stalin's development was that Ukraine did not exist as a political entity. Therefore, it could be part of other people's colonial imaginations, as it was. The Soviet Union was built from internal colonization, and Ukraine was at the center of the exploitation. Hitler imagined that a German empire would exploit Ukraine for its fertile soil. So the first thing is you have to have an independent state. The second important lesson from that book is that Ukraine was in a particularly tragic position because it had empires on both sides. So crucially important for Ukraine is that a Polish state exists between it and Germany, and that both Poland and Germany are friendly towards Ukraine and are part of some kind of larger entity like the European Union. That's obviously the second important lesson, because as difficult as the situation today is, the problem is only on one side. Or if you complain about the Europeans, it's generally that they don't understand the other problem. They're not the problem themselves.
Okay, so lately you wrote an explicit article for the Republic. The battle in Ukraine means everything, and you discussed there how Russia tries to create an alternative reality for all the world, basically. How would you describe that alternative reality, and what are the most difficult things for Ukraine to overcome it?
Yeah, no, the main problem for the European Union is that whether they know it or not, whether they understand it or not, whether they like it or not, they are in the same historical reality as Ukraine. If Ukraine succeeds, they will be fine. If Ukraine fails, they will have a big problem, because Ukraine is basically a kind of test case for the European Union. Russian policy is designed to weaken the European Union, to turn the European Union back into what Russian leaders think is natural. That is, a nation state here, a nation state there, a nation state here, where the nation states have bilateral relations with Russia. In that world, Russia is relatively more powerful. In that world, Russia can sell its natural gas to these countries, because without the European Union, they will never come up with some kind of common energy policy. So what the Europeans don't understand is that the entire information war about Ukraine is not about Ukraine. It's about building up an alternative reality of fascism and anti-fascism, an alternative reality in which Putin is a kind of hero to be admired, an alternative reality which is meant to draw the Europeans back towards something like the 1920s and the 1930s, which for Europeans would be a disaster. For Russia, it would be fine. I think it ultimately wouldn't be better, but it would be fine. But for Europeans, it would be a disaster.
So this is a tough question right now. How would you say Russia embraced this anti-fascist narrative, as we can say basically the rhetorical strategy for its media, and what we can see in Russia today, in other Russian medias around the world?
Yeah, well, the idea of fascism and anti-fascism is that the fascists are the bad guys and the anti-fascists are the good guys. And of course, everyone in Germany and elsewhere in Europe, but especially in Germany, wants to be on the side of the anti-fascists. So the rhetorical strategy is meant to present Russia as being good because Russia is opposing the fascists. There are some strange things about this rhetorical strategy. One of them is that the tendency in Russia itself is to move towards the right, and in some ways towards what's clearly a kind of fascist right. The other strange thing about this is that even as Russia presents itself as the leader of anti-fascism, its friends in Europe, or its closest friends in Europe, are precisely the far-right parties, the populist right parties, and the neo-Nazi parties, all of which support Putin against Ukraine, none of which actually support Ukraine. So there's a basic contradiction here, where you yourself ally with the fascists, and then you say you're against the fascists. Because they don't care about, I mean, the Russians themselves know this, but they don't care, and they think that we in the West are too stupid and slow to figure it out, and they might be right.
You were also discussing the calculations that are made by Putin today and by Stalin in 1939. What would you say are those common things, and what are the threats for Ukraine in that particular moment?
Yes, the common thing is the idea that the way to destroy Europe is to ally with the European far right. So when Stalin made his alliance with Hitler in 1939, the idea was, if there's peace between Moscow and Berlin, Germany will attack France and Britain, and then European capitalism will fall apart. That was Stalin's calculation, which he was very explicit about. Putin's calculation is that if he makes an alliance with the European far right, these people will win elections, they will pull the European Union down, and not European capitalism, but this European social democratic integration project will fall apart. So the tactic is exactly the same. The only difference is that Stalin was looking at it from the position of a communist who thought capitalism was going to collapse, whereas Putin is looking at it from the position of a nationalist who wants this cooperative, peaceful project to collapse. But in both cases, the instrument that's being chosen is the far right.
We can see now that Ukraine basically got this major problem within its own country, and the problem is, the biggest threat is the identity, and we can say that it's totally a clash, even though there are still Ukrainians in south of Ukraine and east who remains to be totally Ukrainian. How would you describe this problem, and what are the possible solutions for that?
Well, as I see it, the problem for Ukraine, a bit like the problem for Europe, is that now people have to make a choice. I mean, for many Ukrainian citizens, the question of identity was not forced upon them, and now it has been forced upon them. To some extent by the Maidan, but mostly by the Russian intervention. If you're in Kharkiv or if you're in Luhansk, it's hard now not to make a choice. And some people are choosing to be Ukrainians and some people are choosing to be loyal to Russia. But you can't avoid the choice anymore. Ultimately, I have a very boring answer. Ultimately, the only thing that can be done is to convince people in Luhansk and Donetsk that the Ukrainian state has the most to offer them, that it would be better for them to be attached to the Ukrainian state than to be in a Donetsk republic or to be in Russia. Identity issues cannot be resolved by other identity issues. They can only be resolved by political proposals which make sense.
So now I would like to go further on your reflections maybe on the current situation in Ukraine. You said and you discussed in your latest article in the Republic that the presidency of Yanukovych was really specific, even comparing to all the other presidents, even though most of the experts and just people in general say that he wasn't any worth actually that any other president in Ukraine. What was so specific in your opinion about this president, and how did it come that we can say that the pro-Russian politics in Ukraine led to something really contrary?
Well, there was one thing which was not, in fairness, Yanukovych's fault, which it just happened while he was president, and that is that traditional Ukrainian foreign policy became impossible. The traditional Ukrainian foreign policy, basically from Kravchuk forward, was to tilt towards Russia and then tilt towards the West, and then go back and forth and try to always use the possibility that you could tilt the other way as leverage against the other side. That, in 2013, that became impossible because Russia stopped being a state towards which you could tilt and started becoming a project of absorbing you into the Eurasian Union. So Yanukovych was the first Ukrainian president who could no longer tilt back and forth. So that wasn't his fault, that was just a new reality. The thing that was special about Yanukovych, as I see things, is that he was trying to put an end to the kind of pluralism which Ukraine has always had, which is oligarchical pluralism, that you have oligarchs who have regions, who have companies. Like even in the worst times, you had that kind of pluralism. I think what was different about Yanukovych, and I think what was unexpected about Yanukovych, was that he was actually trying to become the biggest of the oligarchs and to control all of the other ones. I think the other oligarchs didn't expect that, in fact. And I think that was what was different about him, this attempt, rather than kind of accepting Ukraine as it was, but to actually transform it and centralize it economically. I think that was new.
So most of the experts, and I could say also the people in general in Ukraine, didn't believe that after Orange Revolution really succeeded and totally failed ever after, that people will ever go on the streets again, because they kind of lost a faith, we can say, in Ukrainian politicians and in politics in general. Considering all your research, how would you say, did you even believe that something like that could happen in Ukraine, and did you believe that all these pro-Russian politics could lead to something really different and some major transformations in consciousness of Ukrainians, and I would say politicians too?
No more than anyone else. And I don't think Ukrainians expected it either. I think it was a surprise to you, and I think a lot of it had to do with people being pushed to a point where they understood that the consequences would be very bad for them if they did not react. So not having an association agreement with the European Union was bad for some people, but then having a state where the police will beat up the students is worse for more people. And then in January, having a state which essentially turns itself into a dictatorship by passing all of those laws is worse for more people, right? And so Ukrainians found themselves facing a situation where the future looked ever worse, right? By January, it looked much worse than November, and by February, of course, it looked much worse than January. I guess I wasn't surprised that Ukrainians reacted to each of those things. I think what happened was that you were being run by a president who, on the one hand, disposed of a lot of power domestically, but because of his own practices, because he stole so much money, because he made himself dependent on Russia, had very little room for maneuver. If he wanted to be president, he had to do what the Russians were telling him to do, and those things are what provoked the revolution. So I think Ukrainians surprised themselves.
We can see now that some politicians and even media and loads of businesses does support Russian position on Ukraine, and if that are even minor cases like you discussed in one of your articles, like Neue Rechte, Die Linke in Germany, would you say that that could have basically any influence on the strategy of the European Union as the whole on the question of Ukraine?
No, I mean, it certainly plays a role, because a lot of energy that should have been focused on how to help the Ukrainian state has instead gone towards the completely false question of, whether Yatsenyuk is a fascist, right? Which is a totally ridiculous question. Whatever you say about Yatsenyuk, it's totally ridiculous. But a lot of West European energy and German energy has gone towards these polemical discussions, which make no sense, rather than talking about the actual problems of supporting the Ukrainian state. In that sense, it matters. If you mean, do the intelligent people in Germany believe this? No, for the most part, they don't believe it. But it is a big distraction. It's a way of turning what should be a relatively simple discussion about the Ukrainian state into a complicated discussion about the German past. I mean, anyone who can take a discussion and turn it towards the German past is affecting things, because the Germans always need to go through all kinds of complicated apologetics if it's about their past. And so the effect is to somehow turn Ukraine 2014, into Germany 1939. That does have an effect. It does have an effect. It's not a decisive effect, but it's important.
So we talked a lot about the historical perspective, the trends and the possibilities, some specific questions. But what do you say at this current point? What are the most important things for Ukrainian government to consider, and what would you wish to our Ukrainian citizens?
Well, I wish for Ukrainian people as a whole peace and prosperity, and my only advice to people in government and people outside of government is that there's no difference between patriotism and law. So if you want Ukraine to succeed, it has to succeed as a state that observes the law. And anyone who cares about the Ukrainian nation has to see it that way. I think if you're going to make it into Europe, if it's going to become the kind of country where people don't have to protest, it's going to be because the rule of law wins. I think that is the real contest now.
So I'm really delightful and happy to have this amazing guest, Tymothy Snyder, in my show Q&A on Espresso TV.